This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Saturday, April 11th, 2020. I'm Caleb Brown. It's a pretty typical move for this president, suggest a policy that is highly controversial and probably unconstitutional, and then back down a few hours later. But in the case of Donald Trump suggesting that he might quarantine 3 northeastern states, the hottest of the COVID-19 hotspots, the question has to be asked, is that in any way constitutional? Cato's Gene Healy comments. What powers do we understand the president to possess with respect to quarantining people or states or hotspots, to use the president's term?
Well, it wasn't much more than a week ago now that President Trump, as he often does, tweeted out a proposal that was kind of shocking. He talked about an all caps federal quarantine of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And I think it's only several hours later, he backed it down to just having the CDC issue a strong travel advisory. But for a period of several hours, he put on the table the idea of a federal quarantine around 3 states with some 30 million people, which was a fairly alarming idea. Um, so, he makes a lot of, we've talked about this pattern before. He tends to tweet out sometimes some crank theories, and then never do much with them. And a lot of times it ends up being like the more alarming version of hey, let's buy Greenland. Uh, in this case, though, I think it is worth worrying about because we're in the middle of a fairly unprecedented crisis, and in times of crisis, often presidents are driven towards extreme and highly visible and often regrettable actions. So, what quarantine authority does the federal government have? It does have some. The main law for that is something called the Public Health Service Act, and it does include quarantine authorities for the federal government. It's mainly outward facing. The strongest authorities that it provides uh, relate to people crossing international borders, but there is under the Public Health Service Act at least some authority for internal quarantine power. The act allows federal officials, CDC officials, to stop and examine people that are, quote, reasonably believed to be infected with a communicable disease if they're intending to move across state lines. But the way the law is phrased, it clearly envisions individualized testing for people, to see whether they have a communicable disease. It really is quite a stretch to imagine that this law could be used to impose, not just a statewide quarantine, but a quarantine around 3 states. Sort of an internal travel ban. It's like build the wall, but build the wall not at the southern border, but around the tri-state area.
So it's never been used in the way that the president suggested?
No, nothing like it. The CDC is historic. I mean, of course, we haven't had a pandemic flu since 1918, before the law went into effect. But for the most part, the law has been used for. There's a do not board list that CDC maintains for air travel. If people have things like tuberculosis and that sort of thing. Um, Very few quarantine orders, and they're usually individualized, have been issued under the Public Health Service Act. Over the last 20 or so years, only about a dozen or so up until this time. So it would be extremely radical and ambitious interpretation uh, of this statute, given how it's been used in the past.
Is anybody making any claims on behalf of the president that this is legal or would be legal?
It's hard to say because so many times the President Trump will just tweet out something like, I have the absolute right to pardon myself, or I'm going to revoke birthright citizenship by an executive order. And it's not clear how serious it is. Uh, People tend to, law professors, you know, go to the Lexis, the Lexis website and try and research this, trying to figure out if he can do it. And a lot of times it doesn't amount to anything. So it is not very clear that this was anything more than he was coming under some pressure from people like the Florida governor about New Yorkers coming to Florida, and he's sort of thinking out loud in the middle of a pandemic on Twitter, which is not really great practice. Um, but it's not clear whether this is something that the Office of Legal Counsel is. I kind of tend to doubt that the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel is writing memos about this now, but I think it is something that's worth looking at because, uh, well, number one, it's interesting, and number two, uh, I think his offhand comments and his uh, sometimes alarming tweets are probably worth paying more attention to now in the middle of a crisis of this magnitude. Uh, for the because of the possibility that there's a greater possibility that things like this will be done. So um, I think it's worth thinking about, if only to uh, remind ourselves of why something like this would be an absolutely terrible idea.
So, under what circumstances then can the military be used domestically, if not for a situation like this, a situation that may be much, much worse?
Well, that's one obvious question that comes up is where would they get the manpower to do this? The CDC doesn't have a police force. Even now, even though we've had so much federalization of crime over the years, law enforcement is mostly a local and state responsibility. And unless the federal government is going to divert thousands of Customs and Border Patrol officers to encircle New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, the way that this would have to be done is with U.S. troops, federalized National Guard, and Army and Marines. And that, is a pretty dystopian idea for, I think, pretty obvious reasons.
So, short of that, what could be a military role to help fight the spread of COVID-19?
There's plenty of things that the military can do. There is this long-standing federal statute, 150 some years old, or almost 150 years old, the Posse Comitatus Act, that makes it a criminal offense to use U.S. military forces to execute the laws. But the Posse Comitatus Act has a lot of exceptions. Um, there's and it only applies when troops are in a policing role. It only applies when they're coercing, using the threat of force, um, really, in a sense, turning their guns against U.S. citizens. And that's an alarming prospect. But there's plenty that the military can do, short of using standing armies to enforce internal security. I mean, the Pentagon is the largest employer in the world. It has manpower and assets that it can bring to bear in this pandemic. And the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't say anything about those, logistical and material support. And that's fine. I don't think anyone should be too worried about that. We're already seeing some of, you know, what they call defense support to civil authorities. There's the USNS Comfort, the Navy hospital ship that they sent to the New York area. President Trump recently announced that he's sending an additional 1,000 military personnel to New York City to help fight coronavirus. Now, these are not people that are going to be, you know, enforcing a quarantine. They're mostly Air Force and Navy doctors and medics and nurses, and they're going to provide healthcare at field hospital recently set up in the Javits Center. And I think all of this is good, and none of it requires the military to turn its guns against American citizens. We've seen a lot of debate about how various countries have responded to the coronavirus, and I think there's really no doubt that our response has not been uh, top notch. Um, I think the way the free society can respond to something like this is different than the way an authoritarian country can, and certain tactics ought to be off the table. It's always very tempting for presidents to they tend to like to use a war metaphor to say that, as Trump did recently, I'm a war president. And once you start thinking that way, you've got a hammer and every problem looks like a nail. But the military, with all its assets, all its manpower, there's a good reason we have a tradition that says that use of the military at home in a law enforcement role should be a last resort. They shouldn't be first responders. And as far as I can tell, there is no reason to depart from that tradition, even in this crisis.
Gene Healy is a vice president at the Cato Institute and author of The Cult of the Presidency. Subscribe to the Cato Daily Podcast wherever you please and follow us on Twitter @Cato Podcast.